Okay. What is up there, YouTube? This is J-Man Time, and today I have a video on rare weapons or infantry weapon of the First Anglo-Boer War from 1880. Now, the Anglo-Boer Wars were a series of colonial conflicts between the South African Boers of both the Orange Free State, the South African Republic, and the Transvaal Republic against the invading British colonial forces in Africa. Now, the conflict between the Boers and the British actually began many decades earlier in the early 19th century, starting in 1806. In 1806, the British had annexed the Dutch South African territory known as the Cape Colony. This was actually the first major conflict between the British Empire and the Dutch-speaking Boers in South Africa. Later on, in 1877, the British had annexed another Dutch Boer-speaking territory, the state of Transvaal, or the Transvaal Republic, which was led by a man named Paul Kruger and a secondary representative named E.J.P. Jorison. Both Kruger and Jorison actually traveled to Britain in order to regain the Transvaal's independence, but the British rejected this. Later on, in 1880, there was an incident between the South African Boers living in the now annexed Transvaal and the British police in the area. The entire incident began in November of 1880. A Boer farmer by the name of Piet Bezuidenhof, a Dutch farmer, had his farming wagon, illegally confiscated by the British military police in the area. The British annexed his wagon. The British confiscated his wagon because they believed that he didn't pay some kind of tax, as the Boers were being taxed in order to pay for the British Empire, just like all of the other colonial territories controlled by the British in Africa and worldwide. As a result of this, many Dutch farmers in the area began to revolt against the British. On the same day that this happened, a group of Dutch farmers, armed farmers, decided to confront the British military police in the area over the incident with Piet Bezuidenhof's wagon. This later led to a shootout between the Dutch Boer farmers and the British police. This incident led to many other skirmishes occurring between November and early December 1880, which eventually led to the Dutch declaring independence for the state of Transvaal, or the Republic of Transvaal, which was later renamed the South African Republic. Later on December the 20th, 1880, the British began landing in more troops, and thus the First Boer War began between the Dutch-speaking Boer resistance in the Transvaal/South African Republic and the invading British forces. Now, during the Boer War, both the Dutch-speaking Boers and the British had a variety of different infantry rifles. So let's go over the Dutch weapons first, as they are the main defender in this conflict. Now, the most common infantry rifle, or just rifle used by the Boer forces, was, funny enough, a British-made rifle known as the Wesley Richards Model 1869. The Model 1869 was a single-shot, breech-loading, falling block action, single-shot rifle manufactured in 1869. Now, this is actually a hunting rifle. Keep in mind, most, if not all, of the Boer soldiers in the First Boer War were all farmers. They were just farmers and hunters, so they didn't have access to military weapons, at least not at first. And the ones who did have military weapons, they purchased them off the black market, usually in the British territories or in other colonial territories nearby. The Wesley Richards rifle was chambered in .450 Wesley Richards, and these are black powder cartridges, high-powered black powder hunting cartridges. They were purchased in the years between 1870 and 1880, as it was a very popular hunting rifle used by the Dutch in the region. So the British soldiers in the First Boer War were largely being killed by a British-made rifle, the Wesley Richards Model 1869. It's almost like the Dutch-speaking Boers were just trolling the British by shooting them with their own rifle. The Boers also used a slightly older rifle known as the Wesley Richards Model 1860. It was a single-shot, breech-loading cap-lock action paper cartridge rifle that was chambered in the .450 cartridge also. But this was a paper cartridge instead of a metallic cartridge like the Model 1869. And these two rifles were the most common rifles used by the Boer forces at the very start of the conflict. Now, there were also some Boer soldiers who had imported weapons or weapons that were purchased off the black market that were not purchased from the British or any of the surrounding territory. Most of these rifles came from the US, and the most common of the imported rifles that were imported from non-British colonial territories was the American-made Spencer carbine. The Spencer carbine is a lever-action repeating rifle that entered service in the 1860s. It had a 7 to 10 round internal tubular magazine located in the buttstock. Now, the Spencer rifle is actually an American Civil War era rifle. It was manufactured for the Union Army starting in 1862. Now, the rifles were chambered for the .56-56 Spencer cartridge. This was an early metallic cartridge, an early fully metallic cartridge that was used and manufactured in the US for the Union Army. Now, the Boers managed to purchase these in the mid to late 1870s. After the American Civil War, the Spencer carbine was actually exported to a number of countries. Most commonly, these were exported to France during the Franco-Prussian War in 1870-1871. And many of these were also exported to the Dutch-speaking Transvaal Republic before the British annexed it in 1877. So these Spencer carbines were pretty advanced compared to what the British were using themselves and what the Boers were mostly using also. Another advanced rifle at the time was the American Winchester Model 1876. The Winchester Model 1876 is an American hunting rifle, lever-action hunting rifle from 1876. It was an update to the Model 1873 and Model 1866 Winchester rifles that came out in the mid to late 1860s and early 1870s. Now, this rifle was famous for being used during the American Indian Wars, and many of these were also imported or purchased off the black market by the Boer farmers before the British annexed the Transvaal in 1877. Another British rifle that was used in the conflict was the Calisher-Terry carbine. These were breech-loading, bolt-action, single-shot paper cartridge rifles. In fact, these were purchased by both the Union and the Confederate forces during the American Civil War also, and they were also used in the First Boer War by many of the Dutch farmers, although these rifles were pretty rare when compared to the other rifles I mentioned earlier. Another, even more common British rifle used by the Boers was the British-made Schneider Infield from 1860. Now, this was a British breech-loading single-shot cartridge rifle manufactured in 1860, or at least designed in 1860, and was manufactured all the way into the 1870s when it was eventually replaced by the Martini-Henry single-shot breech-loading rifle. Now, these rifles, the Schneider Infield, were pretty common in colonial Africa, as again, these were some of the cheapest and easiest to obtain single-shot cartridge rifles at the time that you could find in pretty much all of Africa at this time. And small numbers of the Schneider Infield were purchased by Dutch farmers before the annexation in 1877 and the outbreak of war in 1880. Now, these Schneider Infields were also captured from British soldiers. Many of the British colonial troops were issued Schneider Infields, while the regular British soldiers were issued the Martini-Henry rifles. The Schneider Infield was chambered for the .577 Schneider cartridge, which was a high-powered black powder cartridge for the time. You also had some Boer soldiers who had either purchased or captured British-made Martini-Henry rifles. The Martini-Henry was the most common rifle used by almost all British forces at this time, or British regular infantry at the time. It was chambered for the .77 Martini-Henry cartridge, and it was a single-shot breech-loading rifle. Now, Dutch soldiers managed to purchase some of these off the black market before the war, and they also captured a ton of these during the war, as the British Army was always in retreat, at least throughout most of the First Anglo-Boer War. So by the end of the conflict, the Boers had actually amassed an entire stash or weapons conch worth of Martini-Henry rifles. At least a few thousand of these were either captured from soldiers or were left behind by retreating British soldiers, or were left behind in various ammunition warehouses and storage facilities by the British during the retreat towards the very end of the First Anglo-Boer War. So these are pretty much the standard issued rifles that were used by the Boer forces during the war. The most common was the Wesley Richards Model 1869 and Model 1860 rifles, the cartridge rifle, and the paper cartridge rifle, and then you had imported weapons like the American Spencer carbine and Winchester Model 1876. And then finally, the most advanced rifle used by the Boer forces actually came from Switzerland, and these were the Swiss Vetterli Model 1869 rifles. The Vetterli Model 1869 was a Swiss-made bolt-action rimfire repeating rifle manufactured from 1869 until 1878 when it was updated. The version that the Boers used was the Model 1869 version. Now it was chambered for the 10.4 by 38mm Swiss rimfire cartridge, which was an early black powdered rimfire metallic cartridge, or metallic rimfire cartridge. It was a very powerful cartridge for the time. It was basically like the 50 cal of bolt-action repeating rifles. And the Boer forces managed to get their hands on at least a few hundred of these before the outbreak of war in 1880. And these were the most advanced rifles used by the Dutch during the war. Now, what made the Vetterli rifle advance was the fact that it had an 11-round tubular magazine, internal tubular magazine. So it had the highest capacity, or the highest magazine capacity, out of all the rifles used by the Dutch forces. And in fact, the British had no rifles that could equal the Swiss Vetterli Model 1869 rifle. So this was the most advanced rifle used in very small numbers by Boer forces during the First Anglo-Boer War. And in fact, many of these more advanced magazine-fed rifles are why the British forces were pretty much destroyed throughout the entire conflict. The Boer forces of the South African Republic, or the Republic of Transvaal, only suffered just 25 casualties that were killed and 47 wounded, while the British forces suffered over 400 casualties killed and another 480 wounded. And the entire conflict only lasted about 4 months, from the 20th of December 1880 until March of 1881. So in just 3 to 4 months, the Boer forces of the South African Republic and the Transvaal Republic managed to defeat the most powerful military on earth at the time. Remember, the British Empire in the 1880s was basically the equivalent of the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany combined in terms of firepower. They had troops from Britain, British India, the Middle East, Africa, and all over. And the Dutch managed to defeat them in just 3 to 4 months. And so there you have it. These were the Dutch weapons of the Boer War, the First Boer War of 1880 through 1881. Which of these did you like the most? Please tell me in the comments section below. And until next time, this was J-Man Time signing off.